Justin, what is the current role of the government and how is that potentially changing today?
George Friedman argues the next institutional crisis we will go through is going to be a crisis of the federal government's relationship to the federal government. And no, that's just not word salad. Let me explain. Go back to World War III and the Depression. That was the last big crisis. And the crisis question that had to be answered was, what is the relationship of the federal government to the people? Now, in order to fight the Depression and win World War II and manage the Cold War, the federal government had to intrude into vast parts of the American life, far beyond what the founders had envisioned, as Friedman notes. This gave us the concept of various things. For example, the three-letter agencies that came from this, the EPA, the FDA, SEC, just et cetera. These vast swaths of administrative three-letter agencies that were brought on board to help Congress make this specific policies that America needed. So this was a very interesting situation because essentially what Congress was doing is Congress was outsourcing their ability to make law, the legislative function to these three-letter agencies, to these experts. Now, the reason it worked, arguably, for such a long time is because the experts were doing what they were actually good at doing, and more importantly, they had a common vision. So in World War II, the common vision was to win World War II. In the Cold War, the common vision was, well, we need to win the Cold War. So you had all these experts, people who were very, very good at doing a very, very small set of things, but the small set of things, boy, could they do well. And there was this built-in big picture goal that everyone was working towards. Now, since the end of the Cold War, what's happened since then, this is again what Friedman would argue, is we've had this concept of diffusion, where now you have these big agencies who kind of have lost the plot. And this is basically, I'll talk about the EPA and the Supreme Court ruling here in a second, because that's where all this is going to go. But the point is that without a unifying vision, you have these large entities that come in, they start battling with other entities for funding, for turf, or for whatever. And then they start making more and more and more nitpicky policies. So again, this takes us back to the EPA. If you have the EPA going through with no one to check the EPA. Sure, the EPA has been given a mandate by Congress, thou shalt protect the environment, which is arguably a noble goal. But there's no counter to that. It's like, well, thou shalt protect the environment at what cost? Again, not to get too far down the macro rabbit hole, but if you take a bunch, looking at you, Germany, but if you take a bunch of nuclear power plants offline, you don't want to do any drilling internally, how are you going to source your energy needs? Right? You're going to be importing stuff, and just completely ignoring the fact of arguably how green nuclear energy can be. When you do these things with maximizing one goal, which that expert might be very, very focused on. So in other words, a expert in the environment will always see it through the lens of what he or she needs to do in terms of protecting the environment. Just like someone at, the DOE, Department of Energy, might view it as, we've got to, get the maximum of energy for the cheapest, cost possible, screw the environment or whatever, right? Just to make a very, bright line examples here. So when you have these experts that start battling with each other, the entrepreneurs kind of get caught in the middle. Because let's say you're a power company. I think this gets back into West Virginia. You want to build power plants or whatever, right? Because you can see, hey, listen, the grid needs more energy. We're running low on juice or whatever, right? We need to build this stuff up. And just for whatever odd reason, coal, nuclear, et cetera, might be the most obvious thing. Yeah, solar, wind is great. But at the end of the day, we have base load. And if you can't take care of the base load, you're going to have a problem. So this is where the EPA would come in. And the EPA would make policy, but the policies they make carry the de facto stand of law because Congress has devolved its power to it. The reason Congress devolved its power to it goes back into the third institutional crisis, as Friedman noted, where you had to have the federal government intrude into these, deep into how the people function, into the economy, into education, into people's private lives or whatever, right? But since then, because there's no unifying theory, there's really no way to push back against this intrusion. And so what this means is that, like, let's say you wanted to push back against the EPA or whatever, right? It would be very hard to put, or I mean, if you tried to seek legal recourse or whatever, right? You've tried to sue the EPA, there's a good chance you might run up in what would be called an administrative law court. And this is above my wheelhouse, but work with me here, Josh. So in other words, you would have to go, let's say you're an energy company wanting to build a coal power plant in West Virginia. You would have to go to the EPA and talk to people to plead your case, people that were selected by the EPA who are probably intellectually aligned with the EPA and, who probably will side with the EPA. And there's really no way to get back. It is very hard to seek recourse as an individual or as a company to this unless you have enough firepower or whatever to fire back. And, most people aren't going to be able to do that. So what does this all have to do with, the Supreme Court ruling against the EPA and all this stuff? Well, as I understand it, the Supreme Court came out and said, okay, listen, Congress, you cannot devolve your authority en masse to these three-letter agencies. Sure, you can use them if you need help writing a specific policy. And to be fair to experts, this is, I think, something where experts can really shine. But Congress, you just can't say, oh, EPA, deal with the environment, or DOE, deal with energy. Like, no, 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 no. You've got to give much clearer and much more in-depth and much more, for lack of a better word, cognizant and coherent bright line instructions. Because if you don't do this, like, there's how on earth are the people, are the regulators making policy going to know? And moreover, if a citizen or a company or whatever wants to push back, like, you just can't, take, any complaint or whatever, right, and bring it in house with like a kangaroo court where the three-letter agency is judge, jury, and executioner. That's not fair. And the reason we're seeing this right now, and then I think it was maybe 1 or 2 months ago out of the Fifth Circuit, there was that rebuke to the SEC from that too.
So Justin, let me try and explain this for you. Is basically what I'm hearing is we've been through this prolonged period of Congress kind of offshoring their macro view to sub agencies with all these three-letter agencies. And
yep. So John, let me just do one thing. You have the legislative branch whose job is to make laws, and the executive branch, the president, whose job is to enforce the laws. And so what Congress has been doing is they've been taking like the legislative function, they're making the laws, and they've been kicking that over to the executive in these three-letter agencies. But there's no real recourse to the people through the three-letter agencies because like Congress isn't giving any real direction. So
and then they're kicking this off to these experts. They're experts in their small field. But what they're not good at is seeing the big picture. That's where Congress is supposed to be good at. They're supposed to have the macro view. They're supposed to see the forest beneath the trees. But so these three-letter agencies are now imposing rules that are acting as if they were law, which is an issue because they are not law. And that is preventing entrepreneurs from making goods and services, which would be providing wealth to everyday citizens. The issue that I see that I think me and Justin actually might disagree on is I think this issue is just government is too big. We have the ability where Congress can offload a lot of their lawmaking ability to these three-letter agencies because government itself is actually just way too big. Because there's two types of people in this world: people who want to control people and people who want control of objects and things. And people who usually rise to the top of government are the ones who want to control other people. That is just always the way it is. And as we sacrificed our freedoms after the World War and the Cold War to kind of bring peace and to let these three-letter agencies rise and our experts kind of flourish throughout the nation, we kind of gave up a lot of our freedoms and let government get way too big. So now we're sitting at a time where government is way too big, and the people in power, their only goal is to obtain more power. They don't really care about the macro view. They care about staying in power and staying in control of other people. So I do not think the solution can be as easy as one of these laws getting put into place, because these laws are getting put into place by people whose only concern is actually maintaining and getting more power. So I think the only solution to this problem right now is actually shrinking the size of government from where it is today.
No, I would say I agree with that. I would put on maybe a more nuanced view of this. For some things, the government needs to be big. And I would say big is actually the correct answer. Consider the military. Again, Friedman, points this out too, and I think it's very good. Like, in order to, run, a blue or a deep water Navy, and in order to assure, economy for, the American interests, like the military by definition must be large, right? Like if you're dealing with something of the Cold War, to deal with the collective defense of the land, especially if you're running an empire, like by definition, it must be large. Large isn't necessarily the problem. I think the problem is that when you have a disconnect between the people who make the rules and the people who the rules are supposed to help, that's the problem. And I would say that when you force the rule makers, who should be Congress, to be directly accountable to the people, you still might not have, I mean, there's still going to be friction, but at least there's much more recourse where you don't have, some faceless, bureaucrat, sitting in the EPA or the DOE or whatever, right?
People are not elected, by the way. They get that job and then they have the same power as these people in Congress. But keep going.
Yeah, and I would also say too, like there's some things, I mean, like if you're not already familiar with it, I'm a big aviation buff, I love airlines and fun to talk about. And so I look at the FAA, and so which would be an example of these three-letter agencies, the Federal Aviation Administration. And for some things, like the FAA has actually done a really bang up good job. And there are some very peculiar things that I won't go into right now that just relate to aviation, where actually having like a centralized, authority is actually really, really, really spot on. Or at least it can be when it's working and they're not trying to cover up 737s falling out of the sky because Boeing was in bed with the regulators. That's for a different video. Anyways, so there's some things where I definitely think, it can shine, but like you can't ask the experts. What the experts would be really good at is this. If Congress can say, okay, listen, EPA or whatever, right? Here's the goal. Of course, we want clean air. Of course, we want clean water. But we can't do it by destroying the economy, and we can't do it by having, a bunch of people in West Virginia go without power. So let me ask this question, is there something we can do if, let's say, coal is readily available, and it just happens to fit all the things, whatever, right? Is there something we can do where we can still have the power plant go through, even though we wish that it couldn't, but you've got to balance the need and the want to protect the environment against the needs of the actual people. And sure, it would be nice if we were nothing but wind or solar or whatever, right? But if that can't accommodate baseload, we've got to have a solution for it. And we can't just simply say, oh, this other solution over here, coal, nuclear, whatever, we can't use it because it runs afoul of some policy. Like, no, I'm sorry. We can have goals, to shoot for getting more clean energy, but we can't do it at the expense of saying, you're going to go without, power or whatever, right? That's not fair. And that's the rebuke that I think the experts need right there.
I would jump in there again and say, what you're asking for right now is you just want the right person in government, and you want the right person in power that is going to do the things that I want. And I think that's just a flawed way to look at it, because I think anyone, if someone were to perform everything that you like perfectly, that'd be great. But the reality is, the longer this kind of things goes on, when somebody has too much power, it will eventually corrupt them. It just happens over time and time and time again. And I do not think this time would be different. If let's just say the government's maintained its size, and let's say right now we kind of got rid of the 3-letter agencies, but the government still had the same size.
We see rid of. Do you mean like completely abolish, rebuke? Like, help me understand what "get rid of" means.
I'm sorry.
What does that actually mean?
You cut out there for 1 second.
Oh, Josh, help me understand what "get rid of" means. Does that mean completely abolish? Does that just mean rebuke the power? If you rebuke the power, how?
The 3-letter agencies?
Yeah.
Well, what's going on with the Supreme Court right now?
So what the Supreme Court did is that it hasn't abolished.
They're just giving it more of a check mechanism, right?
Yeah, so what the Supreme Court's saying is that 3-letter agencies, you can't draw on your power from Congress anymore. And if they can't draw on the power from Congress anymore, a company can just look at it and say, hey, listen, we're not going to follow these regulations anymore because of, this precedent, and we're going to sue you for that. So basically it opens the door to them being defanged. So they still exist, but they don't have any teeth anymore. Or at least currently escape.
I guess I misunderstood what was actually going on with the actual Supreme Court ruling. And under those circumstances, I think that'd be very good for entrepreneurs, because that check mechanism wouldn't be in place, which the main check mechanism was these 3-letter agencies were imposing law that were not law upon these institutions or in these entrepreneurs that were making these goods and services. So if that actually were to happen, I think it would be very good for building wealth.
Yeah. And like maybe something else too, like, and this is the other thing, Josh, too, like the role of government, consider like DARPA or whatever, right? Or like NASA, where you have these things that like only like the military can, like, it has, enough of the deep pockets in order to fund. But like from like the space program, whatever, right? It spun off, a lot of other industries, a lot of other technologies. The military, again, this is something Friedman notes, when you have, your iPhone or whatever, right? All the technology that in here ultimately came from the military, probably from DARPA, the internet that we're on right now. It used to be DARPANet, way, way, way back in the day. And so it's one of those things where like, this is actually what you need, the big, powerful government in a sense to do. And I think they're actually really, really good at this function. But what you don't want to do, and I think this is the problem, is that like you don't want them to ask them to do more than what they can do. And this is where we return to Friedman, where he talks about, this is the crisis. What is the federal government's relationship to itself? Again, Friedman, who's much better with words than I am, he makes a comment like, listen, the federal government is actually really, really good at solving crises. They are phenomenal at that job. The problem is that you can't have every problem that needs to be solved be elevated to crisis level in order to get a solution, and nor can you simply just ignore all the other stuff. This is the problem that's running in, and this is this huge thing. And so anyways, getting back to Friedman, I think he was 100% correct. If you've never read or you ever recommend it, the Storm Before the Calm, which is where this comes from, is where he talks about this. And there's also some economic cycles he talks into, that we're going through right now, or that's coming to a head. But again, from Friedman's perspective, this is not the first time in the 2020s that we're having both an institutional crisis impact at the same time we have a financial crisis.
So the way that the actual government's relationship could change to itself could be that they have to define the rules that they want to kind of stand by. Like instead of trying to handle things, instead of giving people what they want, which entrepreneurs are great at, like mega stuffed Oreos, people love that. They need to give people what they need, which is the military, the protection, and like the roads and services. Is that more aligned with the thinking?
Yeah, my thinking is this is like you've got to have a debt. So right now, I think the species or the West, whatever, we're at a crossroad, whatever, right? Do we want to go with Team WEF and full centralization, you'll own nothing, unlike it, or do we want to go with the fact that like no, we're going to devolve as much power as we can back to the states? And again, look at what the Supremes have been doing recently. Earlier this week, I believe the official Roe v. Wade was dropped, or it was last week, within the past 2 weeks, whatever. And many people think that the Supreme Court made abortion illegal, and that's actually not the correct read on it. What the Supreme Court simply said is, no, look, this is a state issue. The states need to decide this stuff. And so to that end, Josh, I would say, like, if you have to decide policy, you want the policy to be decided as close to the local level as you possibly can be. It's said another way, go back to West Virginia. Yeah. If West Virginia...
I wildly agree with that.
Yeah. And so, like, by all means, like, maybe that means, like, do we or do we not want coal power plants to be built? Well, maybe that's like a state by state question. Maybe Californians or Washingtonians say, no, we do not, and we're willing to pay more for that. But we go, good, by all means, go for that. At the same time, as maybe, New Mexico or West Virginia, states that maybe aren't as affluent. It's like, hey, listen, we just need energy. I mean, if we get clean energy, that'd be great. But more important than that, we need energy just to get ourselves, started. And so...
this is it actually gives the individual much more power, because if you actually have control. Let's say you love America and you want to stay there, but you don't love certain places. Let's say you're someone who loves Texas but hates California. You can actually choose between the two and vote with that category. And it doesn't matter which way. It provides you, the individual, the opportunity to go where you are treated best.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's a huge part. So, like I said, how would Friedman argue about this is that this is the relationship that the federal government has to figure out, where, and Friedman's answer to this is that he draws a page from the military about the concept of commander's intent. And as I understand it, if you're in the military or whatever, right, the commander's obligation to his subordinates, his lieutenants, whatever, is to make his intent known, and then to verify that his intent has been correctly understood by his subordinates. In other words, example, like we need to clear this out, or we need to take this field, whatever, right? Then in turn, the subordinates have tremendous, this is where experts are actually quite useful, because the experts will know the ins and the outs of how to make it work, but they've been given the bright line, they've been given the big picture. Oh, we need to, take this field, we need to build this bridge or whatever, right? And that's when you let them off the leash. But you let them off the leash.
That's actually fantastic, and I agree with that more than anything that we have said today. That you have to be extremely clear and definite with what your goals are, which is the complete opposite of what we have today. Where if you listen to any politician, it is pure drivel. They're not even saying words; they're just saying sentences that don't mean anything. Like if their goal was to strictly define what they actually want, that would make everything much, much more coherent and better for everyone. I personally.
So the federal government's relationship to itself is changing because the federal government is starting to have to devolve power back to the people. We're no longer in World War II or the Cold War or whatever, right? Which is a good thing. But at the same time, too, the vast apparatuses, the vast, things we've built in order to regulate this, they've become archaic. They become like dinosaurs. And then they arguably do more harm than good. They stand in the way of America and Americans seeking, wealth, liberty, happiness, etc.
Thank you, and we'll see you on the next one.